people. All right, our objectives for today are to go over the underlying and immediate causes of the Great War and to trace developments that transformed a local conflict into a continent-wide war. So my first question to you, why do they call it the Great War?
Because there wasn't a second war to make it World War II.
There wasn't a second war to make it World War II. What else?
All the countries were involved?
Not all, but
Oh, a lot.
Vast majority.
not all. Never say all.
Oh,
Most.
a lot.
Many countries were involved. Never ever say all. There's usually an exception to every rule, and notice the word I used, usually. So many countries were involved. And the third reason, quite honestly, and probably the most important, up to this point in history, this was the biggest war the world had ever seen. 11 million soldiers died. They spread the Spanish flu around the world, and more people died from that than the war itself. The world had never seen a catastrophe that they had seen in World War I. And so, as we get into this, you know, what really should have been a very local war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia instead became a Europe-wide war. Pause. Just offer something real helpful here. Believe it or not, when I actually teach, I move all over the place. I'm all about animation.
I'm sorry, I was just laughing the way you did pause.
Well, I decided I didn't want to put that in there.
You want to put that on your table? You want to put that on your table?
No, but I probably should move the sanitizer over. Get out of the way. All right. So, are you ready? Oh, this is terrible. Hold on. Keep that pause a second.
Okay.
Oh, what has to happen?
Probably better if we get like a...
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
All right, so most of you may remember MAIN as an acronym to help you remember the underlying cause of war when you've taken this in other classes like world history. Have you guys ever done that? MAIN, militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. You don't need to write all these down just yet. We're going to add a little bit to MAIN, but we're going to kind of change it around a little bit, and we're going to go over each of these individually. But in general, if MAIN helps you to remember the four major underlying causes of the First World War, M is militarism, A would be the alliances, I imperialism, and N nationalism. And I think that's a really good memorization tool, although personally I don't teach in that order because I think the root cause, or what do you think? I think the root cause of all of these other causes was nationalism. I think nationalism was kind of the driving force behind the war, and it led to really all these core causes, and they kind of built upon each other. So I want to start by going over nationalism and talking. So on one hand, nationalism is very self-explanatory. It's this concept of this increased patriotism. An example in modern history, on September 11th, when we were attacked by Al-Qaeda and the World Trade Center went down and the Pentagon was attacked, every school in Knox County got flags. Every window in this school had a flag on the window. We were showing our patriotism. We were showing our unity as a country. Well, during this period between 1871 and 1914, this was a period of increased nationalism. I think nationalism, if you remember our last unit, nationalism has been really, the whole 19th century was about nationalistic fervor. And this continued. So on one hand, you had this increased nationalism like in Germany, this Germanist, this proud to be a part of the German Empire. And the development of the German Empire led to great pride. The French also, you know, very unified, very proud of themselves. The Third Republic, after all the scandals, was finally working. And they were, you know, excelling as a nation. But also part of this increased patriotism also included this concept of jingoism. And in a way, jingoism is this idea that it builds up nationalism through rivalry with another country. And so really what we see in Europe, we see two major rivalries that are developing, one in the West and one in the East. In the West, we have the rivalry between France and Germany. One of Bismarck's few mistakes that he made was the harsh treatment after the Franco-Prussian War. And this harsh treatment included taking Alsace-Lorraine, and the French wanted it back. I mean, really, you know, when you look at nationalism, the French really wanted what from Germany, besides Alsace-Lorraine, just in general? What would you want if you got a whooping?
Revenge.
Revenge. You know, they really wanted revenge. You know, the French were going for. One thing that's interesting about the First World War, in 2003 we went to war with Iraq. I was at Calhoun's on the river, and it came on the news. place was silent. No one was cheering. It was just staring at the news like. In the summer of 1914, in Paris, Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, there were parades. They were excited to be going to war. And kind of this idea of jingoism, this hatred of another country, which just further developed their country. So we have this great rivalry in Western Europe, this Franco-German rivalry. In Eastern Europe, though, we also have a rivalry that has been developing over time, and we'll talk about that shortly, but that's the rivalry between Russia and Austria-Hungary as well. And that rivalry between Russia and Austria-Hungary had its roots going back quite a bit. So, questions? Pause. The reason I'm pausing, I want to check, I put up a different PowerPoint that I thought was better. Okay, I can go with this. Okay. Roll.
Okay.
All right, so, yeah, that. But in addition, we think of nationalism, like American nationalism, American pride. Europe also had a problem with nationalism because there were many what we call subject nationalities. A subject nationality was a group that didn't have their own independent country. So there's a couple examples. The most famous subject nationalities that we all know about were the Slavs of Austria-Hungary. The creation of the dual monarchy gave full rights to the Hungarians and full rights to the Austrian Germans, but the Slavs did not have equal rights. And in fact, in the Hungarian portions of the empire, the Slavs were further suppressed. They were not allowed to, Hungarian was official language, Slavic was not used in the schools, the local languages, and this was really bothersome. You put this into an age where nationalism was growing, and we're going to see really a recipe for disaster. Contributing to that factor is the idea of Bosnia. So on the map, this little area is Bosnia, and Bosnia has kind of an interesting history. So, for right now, you don't need to write any notes. I just want you to listen. You're never going to be tested on this, but I think it'll help explain the big issue. So, going back in 1877-78, Russia fought a war against the Ottoman Empire, the Russo-Turkish War. At this point in history, the Ottoman Empire is falling apart. They're known as the sick man of Europe. But the British don't want the Russians. Go back in Russian history, go back to Peter the Great. The Russians have been trying to take advantage of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great actually gained all this land here. And the Russians wanted what we call access to Constantinople and the Straits. And for the most part, they wanted this because it would give them access to what?
Sea.
What sea?
Mediterranean.
Mediterranean. What country do you think would be most opposed to that? Besides the Ottomans, of course. I mean, they didn't realize that. Which European power would be most opposed?
Britain.
Very good. Great Britain did not want that. Remember, Britain's most important colony was India. Britain, although the French built the Suez Canal here, the British controlled the Suez Canal. They felt that this would greatly upset the balance of power if Russia became expansionary in this area, and they did not want that. So in 1877-78, Russia goes to war with Turkey. They win. I mean, Turkey's weak. They win handily. Even the Italians beat Turkey. That's how bad how weak they are at this point. And so they win this war, but when they win it, they make this treaty that really gives them great influence in this area called the Balkans. Gives them access to the Mediterranean. The great powers of Europe said, no way. And they actually met. It was called the Congress of Berlin. They met and they reversed parts of this treaty. And so what the results were of this war were not what Russia had wanted. In fact, totally opposite. What did happen, we're going to see 3 new independent countries. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. Serbia was kind of the center of Slavic activity, this what we call pan-Slavic movement to unite the Slavic peoples. And Slavic peoples include Serbians, Bosnians, Croatians, Slovenians, Poles, Czechs, Slovakians, Russians. Russia's probably the largest Slavic country. But the southern Slavic, really Serbia was at the head of it. Okay. Bosnia, however, is kind of in limbo. They don't give Bosnia to Serbia, which Serbians wanted. Instead, they let Austria-Hungary occupy Bosnia, much like we occupied Iraq for several years. They occupied, so it's not technically a part of it. Okay. Russia is calling itself Big Brother of the Slavs. It's kind of helpless here. So is Big Brother doing anything good here? They're looking pretty bad. And with that said and done, we're going to see this evolve as kind of an issue. Now, Fast forward 30 years. Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia. So what's the difference between occupying and annexing?
And it's like it's part of it, but not officially.
No,
No.
officially.
It's part of it, but it's not like a state or.
No, it's part, it's
Oh.
purely a part. We annexed Texas.
Oh.
We took it from Mexico.
No,
No.
Texas declared independence first, and then we annexed it. That's why I went to war with Mexico.
Yeah.
It's kind of a similar situation. They just simply annexed it. Now, once again, the Russians do nothing. So Russia is kind of, this big brother Slav is not being very big brother-like, getting a little bit of trouble. Okay, but you do see tension now between Austria-Hungary and Russia over the treatment of the Slavs. And remember I said the Slavs were not treated very well, especially by the Hungarians. The Germans treat them a little bit better, but the Hungarians not so much. A lot of discriminatory laws, and so a lot of Slavs want independence. Now, going back to this idea of subject nationalities, and at this point you begin writing again if you're taking notes. Okay, you have these groups, and there was like, I mean, this was really a time of a lot of terrorist activity. You know, we tend to think of terrorism only in the modern world. In the United States, for example, President McKinley was assassinated by a terrorist in 1901. This terrorist group called the Black Hand had developed, and they were doing lots of small terror activities directed at the Austrians in order to gain this Slavic independence for those areas that were in there and unite with Serbia. And this really continued on until the assassination of the Archduke, and the Black Hand was responsible for that. So you have these subject nationalities disrupting nations. And just so you know, the Slavs weren't the only. In the Ottoman Empire, there were the Arabs who would have liked independence. Later on, they're going to fight against the Ottomans. In Russia, there were like 100 different ethnic groups. Probably the strongest at this point were the Poles, who had wanted independence from Russia. And even in the British Isles, anyone know which country didn't have independence within the British Isles? Irish. You know, and the Irish wanted. During the 1916, the Irish revolted called the Easter Rebellion. The Germans helped them. They encouraged it because in the middle of the war to get, you know, to distract England. And so, you know, subject nationalities were prevalent throughout the nation. There's other smaller groups as well, but it was most notably a problem in Austria and the Ottoman Empire, but especially the Slavic problem within Austria, the Austria-Hungary. All right, so questions. All right. 1912, 1913, we're going to have a couple of crises in the Balkans. And remember, these are the Balkans. It's a mountain range. This is the Baltic, like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. It's a sea. So do know the difference between the Balkans and the Balkans. When you do those maps, kind of think about that. But what we're going to see, this Balkan crisis in 1912, 1913, these three new countries, Montenegro, the purple one, Serbia, Romania, go to war against the Ottoman Empire. You don't need to know the details. They go to war, they win. Like I said, it's not too hard to beat the Ottoman Empire at this point. They win, they get so giddy they start fighting amongst themselves in the Second War. And so the region itself was known as the powder keg of Europe. I don't know if you remember, I don't know if I even told you, Bismarck at one point had been asked if he thought what he thought would happen if there'd ever be another great European war, and if there would be, what would cause it. And his answer was some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. And we do know that that foolish thing was the assassination of the Archduke in 1914. But we have this region that's just unstable. It's just not a settled region. And sadly, I guess 80-something years later, we're actually going to see ethnic cleansing and genocide in the 1990s in that area. You know, still these subject nationalities still fighting amongst themselves. That, by the way, that would be good synthesis to pull that into a nationalistic essay with that. All right. And then, you know, once again, you have the idea of this German nationalism superseding all. And how many have heard that, you know, a lot of historians say that Germany was more responsible for World War I? And some do, and some historians say not so much Germany, other countries as well. One thing, though, is for certain, Germany had a series of aggressive actions between 1890. Bismarck was dismissed in 1890. Kaiser Wilhelm came in charge. Like I said, Kaiser Wilhelm II was the world's stupidest leader. He was given the German Empire in its prime. I mean, he was really handed the strongest economy in the world, great nation, and the schmuck blew it. You know, when all is said and done. You know, he wanted to make friends with Britain, so what does he do? He bashes them in the press. He has a naval race against them. Good way to make friends. But Germany, the Kaiser, you know, Bismarck was content with just a European empire, the German empires we see on that map. The Kaiser wanted a world empire, just like Britain and France had. He wanted to find Germany's place in the sun. And this ultra-German nationalism is going to really lead to what I would say reckless actions of Germany that helped contribute to World War I when it broke out. So, any questions about nationalism? Okay, this increased nationalism also led to imperial conflict, colonial rivalry. Okay, who are the countries that had colonies from a long time ago? Who are the strong countries that did?
Britain,
Britain.
Spain.
France?
Spain's kind of weak at this point. France, Britain and France are the two biggies. Belgium had the Congo. Okay, why did Germany not have many colonies?
They didn't have a strong navy.
They didn't have a strong navy, but also they didn't exist before 1871. You know, and so Germany would said they want to find her place in the sun. Now, but we are going to see in the 1870s. I think we talked about this. We talked about like tonic water and all that.
Yeah.
So in the 1870s with imperial, we're going to see imperial conflict, and we're going to see some issues over Africa. And in particular, I want to talk about the Boer War. And I may have mentioned this last time. Did we talk about the Boer War last time?
Yeah.
The Boer War was in South Africa, and it was the white Afrikaans, they were like descendants of Dutch settlers, that fought against the British. The British were really being pretty greedy. They went into this area to essentially take it for the gold and the diamonds that were discovered there. And they fought back. The British actually used concentration camps in the Boer War. They were not like the death camps the Nazis used, but there were, I want to say like, in the tens of thousands of people who died in these camps from malnutrition and malnourishment. It was, you know, not this. And the Germans kind of brought this to the world's attention. They antagonized the British. It reminds me, and you guys of course are too young to remember, but it's 2003 when we went to war with Iraq. One of our allies, France, was very opposed to the war, and they made no effort to hide how opposed they were. They told us we were wrong for doing this. And we were angry. We were angry with the French. And in fact, in all the places, like in the capital, the cafeterias, they renamed their French fries Freedom Fries, you know, to show this anger with the French, this friction. We weren't at war with France, and Britain wasn't at war with Germany, but it was kind of that same situation. The Germans are kind of bashing them, and the British are getting irritated, and it's just leading to friction between the two. Now, also, for the majority of this course, what country has been Britain's most serious rival?
France.
France. You know, this is actually leading the Brits to say, you know what, maybe we need to make up with the French. Before this, I think in American history, it's a minor thing in American history. I actually think it should be a much more important thing. Us and the Brits, we always kind of fought after our revolution. We were that unruly child. But in the 1890s, the Brits claimed land in Venezuela. And we stepped in and said, no, no, no. You know, you can't do this. And we were going to go to war with them. We would have lost. And the Brits said, you know what? We think Germany is a bigger threat. It might be time to make peace with the Americans. And that was kind of the beginning of our really good friendship with Britain that continued to be an even better friendship throughout the 20th century. And so Britain is kind of recognizing Germany as a threat. But there's a couple of other things as well. There were the two Moroccan crises. The Kaiser, idiot, challenged, you know, France and Northern Africa. And he did this as sort of a test. The Brits had signed what's called the Entente Cordiale with the French in 1904. The Entente was a friendship treaty. When I went to Britain in 2004, there were signs all over 100 years of friendship with France, you know. And it was like this French, they kind of made peace after this Boer War. The Boer War was 1899 to 1902, if you want to know that for dates. But they had made peace. But this Moroccan crisis, the Kaiser was testing. And the British stood up for the French, and the Kaiser backed down. There was a second Moroccan crisis 5 years later. The French had to give the Germans a slice of the Congo, and in turn the Germans withdrew from Morocco. But once again, we're seeing this, you know, what we're seeing as a result, we're seeing friction between the French and the Germans, of course, but we're seeing the British getting closer to which country? France. And you know, this is going to continue on as well. Okay, don't worry about that stuff there. I'm getting that's a little bit too detailed. But this one here is the other one to worry about, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. The Germans made plans to build a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad. Why would the British object to this? Look at the map.
Sort of kind of goes through just a little bit.
Goes through the Ottoman Empire, splits it. Once again, who's Britain's most important colony? Or what is Britain's most important colony? India. And they're going through that area as well. And so we see that. All right, so there's friction over imperial issues. So, questions. Then going into our third group, and I'll get you out of here within 10 minutes, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Our third group, the idea of militarism. And with militarism, it's just a massive arms race. From the moment the French surrendered to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, what do you think the French would begin to do?
Plan their revenge.
Plan their revenge, built their militaries, but so did the Germany. And there was a dangerous arms race, and the Industrial Revolution fed into this arms race. They were making newer, more massive weapons, you know, and they used machine guns against the Africans, and they used them with great success. The big difference was the Africans didn't shoot back. You know, when they used them against each other, they shot back, and that hurt it. Another interesting feature during this arms race as well was the all of the major countries except for Great Britain. The big five would be Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. Except for Britain, they all had conscription or peacetime draft, just kind of showing those intentions. And in many ways, the arms race, most of the countries really wanted a war. Have you ever wanted to fight with someone? I don't mean fist fight, but you want to have a good argument with someone, like to kind of clear the air? That's really what they were hoping for. You know, a short war would kind of clear the air. The French could get back Alsace-Lorraine. The Germans could prove their superiority, whatever, as well. So we're going to see this very dangerous arms race ensue. So we see the conscription, and we're also going to see war plans that are going to define it. And the war plans, I think, are the most interesting part. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. One of the things Bismarck did that was just so fantastic, what two countries say were the Eastern rivals?
France and Germany.
Eastern.
Russia and Austria-Hungary.
Russia, Austria. Bismarck kept both of them allied together for like 10 years. And then when they finally just couldn't ally together because they just hated each other, he kept treaties with both countries and alliances balanced with both countries, both Russia and Austria. Bismarck's primary goal, Bismarck knew the French wanted revenge. His primary goal was to isolate France. Britain in the 1880s was in her period of splendid isolation. She wouldn't come to France's aid. He kept alliances with Austria and Italy. He kept an alliance with Russia. And he kept France basically isolated. Bismarck's worst fear was France and Russia coming together. Why would that be such a fear for Bismarck?
Because they're just sort of.
It's around Germany, a two-front war. And so Bismarck had signed something called the Reinsurance Treaty with Russia, which basically ensured they'd both stay neutral and not go to war with each other. In 1890, when the Kaiser took over from Bismarck, Kaiser Wilhelm, smart fellow that he is, he said, we're not going to do that anymore. That violates our treaty with Austria. And within 4 years, Russia and France signed an alliance. And so now Bismarck's worst nightmare had come true. And so the German war plan, the von Schlieffen plan, called for a two-front war against France and Russia. And the plan actually makes a lot of sense, but I have to go and explain another component for it to make sense. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and we're going to come back to the von Schlieffen plan. So if you're taking notes, leave some room. So I'm going to jump ahead to the French Plan 17. The French Plan 17 basically was geared up for the Battle of Alsace-Lorraine. All their troops were at the border. Okay. Look at the map real quick, just so you see. All their troops at the Franco-German border geared up for that. Okay. The Russians also had a plan, and the Russian plan called for full mobilization before war. And the students in my class were asking me, they said, Mr. Gallo, that sounds kind of logical. I guess it does, but it's actually not usually practical. And so I'm going to use the U.S. in World War I as an example. We declared war in April of 1917. We didn't have any troops in Europe until January 1918. Why not?
Just to get them together, to get them
Mobilized. You know, we had to mobilize. Most countries don't mobilize before actually going to war. So the Russian plan called us. Now I'm bringing these two in before going over this because what the von Schlieffen plan did, and essentially a good motto to help remember it, Paris for lunch, St. Petersburg for dinner. What does that mean? What do you think?
to sort of do them at the same time.
Paris for lunch, St. Petersburg for dinner.
At the same time.
Not at the same time.
France and then.
Take France first, and then go take Russia. But it relied on a couple of assumptions. So assumption number one, the Russian army would be slow to mobilize. I mean, the Russian army were peasants, they were illiterate, of course. Just so you know, the only thing the Russians did right in the First World War was they mobilized quickly. And it was the only thing they did right. And that is one time I will say only. So that's the first. The second, they assumed that Britain would remain neutral, which she didn't. But the third was, you know, the Germans aren't stupid. They're not going to go in through the Franco-German border. Why not?
Because Austria.
No, right here. Why would they just try to march into France?
Is that where the place, the Alsace?
French Plan 17. They're
Yeah.
ready for that battle. They're geared up. I mean, that's where all their troops are waiting for them. That's going to be a horrible fight. So instead, the Germans said they have to take Paris fast. They're assuming they're going to go through neutral Belgium. And there goes another assumption. Belgium was like, sure, come on in, rape our citizens, pillage our villages, no big deal. Didn't quite happen. The Belgians couldn't give much resistance, but they slowed them down. When the war actually broke out, the Germans enacted their von Schlieffen Plan, and the Belgians slowed them down just a bit. The British got in, they flanked Paris, but they never were able to take Paris. And to make matters worse, like I said, the only thing the Russians did right was mobilize quickly. When the Russian troops sent troops into Germany, they had to remove troops from the Western Front, send them back to Germany, and that was that first Battle of the Marne, resulting in stalemate in the Western Front, the trench warfare. It was unsuccessful. So while the war plan sounded good, it really just relied too much on assumptions. Questions? All right. Also, we're going to see the naval race between the British. So once again, Kaiser Wilhelm's great personality. You know, I want to be friends with the British, so I'm going to do it by challenging them by building up a navy like they do. This does not endear the British to them. In fact, this naval race, the British build, for every one ship that the Germans build, the British build 2 battleships. And I don't know if any of you guys remember this from U.S. history. Any of you remember the book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by Joseph T. Mahan? And it was written during this time period before World War I. And the central thesis was that whoever had the strongest navy would dominate the world's military, would dominate the world. And at this point, it was the British. The U.S. began building up the navy based on this book. The Japanese did, the Germans did, you know, all challenging the British. But the Germans specifically really aggressively challenged the British, which just stressed the British out. The British actually said, you know, made kind of friends with us. They made a naval alliance with Japan. They signed the Entente with France. The British were stressed out by the Germans. The Germans took the British out of that splendid isolation and made the British prepare, you know, for war. They thought they were being too aggressive, and this naval race was part of it. Another little interesting fact, there was really only one great battle between battleships, and it was kind of inconclusive, the Battle of Jutland, despite this naval race. Most of the naval things was the British blockaded Germany, which kept things from going in, and the Germans used submarines. And submarine warfare. And then lastly, we have what we call our entangling alliances, or the alliance system. And so the alliance system is kind of tricky. And so on one hand, you have what's called the Triple Alliance. This was a firm military alliance with 3 powers.
America,
No.
Britain, France.
Nope, that's the Entente.
Oh. Italy, Austria, Hungary, Germany.
Very good. You have Germany and Austria-Hungary, which, by the way, in this alliance, these 2 are like the best friends. You know, this guy was kind of like the odd man out, the third wheel, so to speak. Okay. And then you had the other major one called the Triple Entente. This was actually, the Entente was more of a treaty of friendship, and this was which 3 nations?
Russia, France, and Britain.
Russia, France, and Britain. There's a couple things with these alliances that also kind of came together. So, for example, Russia, oh, why would you be there? Russia was big brother to what country? Or big brother to which group?
Slaughter.
And which small country in the Balkans was the center of Slavic activity?
Serbia.
Serbia. So Russia's kind of allied with Serbia here. Okay. The Brits had signed a naval alliance with Japan, and they were also pledged to defend Belgium. The French and the Italians signed a secret neutrality pact that they wouldn't go to war with each other. And so once again, what winds up happening, you know, it's what should have been this local war between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, within 1 week expands to include most of those nations. Italy, by the way, stays out. Don't ever make allies with Italy. They're not a very faithful ally.
So with this little circle graph, if you like cut it out, would you sort of tape Italy and France together?
Yeah, you could. And that's the whole thing. There's just so many. Like there's like aid, like the Serbians and the Russians, the Bulgarians, the Ottomans and Austrians. You know, and like the Ottomans weren't in the Triple Alliance, but the Ottomans, you know, for 300 years, Russia had been trying to take them over. They feared the Russians. You know, that's why they joined. They probably should have joined with the Brits. The Brits have been protecting the Ottoman Empire for years, but they wouldn't come together with the Russians. And ultimately, you have that, you know, and these, like I said, the whole alliance system, which would, you know, come into play as well. And then finally, one thing that I like to add to the main is just the awful government policies. And don't write this down, but the idea, the French wanted revenge, they wanted war. The British, in that splendid isolation, they wouldn't commit, that the Entente was a treaty of friendship. You know, and that's when, like, historians who sometimes say, you know, the Brits are a little more responsible for this war than the others, they said the Brits could have told the Germans about it. You know, they could have. You know, Germany's place in the sun and the July crises. And so the last thing I want to talk about is the assassination of the Archduke. And with that said and done, on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by a young man named Gavrilo Princip, who was a member of what was called the Black Hand. The Archduke was the heir to the Austrian throne. It's the equivalent of someone a terrorist assassinating our vice president. This group, the Austrians were mad. How many think that they were justified in being mad? Yeah, I mean, they're really justified. And the Serbian government, you know, someone asked, my class asked about Serbian action. At the time, the Serbian government denied knowledge. Later on, they found they knew about it. And the minimum they could have done what? Warn them, which they never did. You know, but Serbia, if you remember in 2001 when we were attacked by terrorists, Al-Qaeda, we didn't go to war against Al-Qaeda. We went to war against Afghanistan. The reason we went to war with Afghanistan, the Afghanistan government, the Taliban at the time, they aided Al-Qaeda, they let Al-Qaeda stay there and train there. And that's why Austria-Hungary sent this ultimatum to Serbia this ultimatum to Serbia that basically they worded real harshly. They wanted the Serbians to say no. Why?
So that they can be justified in going to war.
So they go to war. They're mad. And they were really pretty justified at being mad. You know, they wanted to put an end to this terrorist. This wasn't the first terrorist act. They wanted to put an end to it. But before they went to war, they knew that Serbia would get help from who? Russia. And remember, 2 times before, Russia turned her head. Could Russia turn her head again? She'd lose all credibility. And so Austria-Hungary didn't want war with Russia, so they asked Germany, are you going to have our back? And Germany gave them what they call the famous blank check. You do what you got to do, we've got you. You're covered. And with that said and done, they issued the ultimatum on July 23rd, 1914. Serbia responded unsatisfactorily. And on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war. Now, this is where the war plans come into motion. Okay, if Austria-Hungary is declaring war on Serbia, what country is going to have to start mobilizing for war? Look up here. Russia. What's the German war plan assume about Russian mobilization? So at that point, Germany begins to question. I don't know if you guys read the primary source of your book. They're pretty good. The telegram between the Kaiser and the Tsar. And basically Germany was telling Russia, you need to only partially mobilize. The Russians couldn't. Their illiterate troops were trained for full mobilization. They can't change the plan at the last minute. And so when the Russians replied that they were still going to mobilize, the Germans really had no choice if they were going to win this war. They had to act, and so they declared war on Russia on August 1st. Then they asked Russia's ally France, do you intend to honor your alliance? The French said yes. So on August 3rd, they declared war on France. And they knew they couldn't go to war here, so who'd have to invade? Neutral Belgium. And at that point, who gets involved? Who's pledged to protect Belgium? The British. And so this was on August 4th. So in 1 week, this local conflict became a Europe-wide war. All right, we're done here. Next class, we talk about the war. Just a few general questions that you might have at the reading guide. So bring your reading guides and refresh yourselves. And I'll go over the Russian Revolution with you as well.
And so next week we are, not next week, we are meeting next on the 22nd.
Right, next, is it Tuesday? Or next Wednesday? Wednesday, regular time.
And here?
Yep.
We're not.
And no Google Hangouts, unless you guys want to do one.
No,
mean,
not next week.
I figured that we're going to meet next week anyway, and being we delayed the test, we're in pretty good shape. All right, I need you, by the way, did you cut that?
I will.